Okay, good evening. My name is Björn Hellemark, if you don't know me. Welcome to the public events program on Thursday nights at KTH School of Architecture. And to introduce tonight's speaker, Meike Schalk, who is head of the master's program in sustainable urban planning and design. So Meike, welcome.
Thank you. I don't want to say so much, but welcome tonight to that lecture with Tatjana Schneider. As Björn said, my name is Meike Schalk, and I am part of the urban design research group who is co-financing this event tonight. So it's an enormous pleasure to have Tatjana Schneider here. Tatjana is associate professor at the Architecture School at the University in Sheffield, and she has been here several times, maybe 3 times in the old building for lectures, for workshops, for seminars, and as guest critic. So it's always a huge pleasure to have her here. And she will talk tonight about one of her latest research projects that was Spatial Agency, together with Jeremy Till and Nishat Awan. Some of you may know the website or may know the book that was published on it. Maybe I should also say that KTH, the Architecture School, and Sheffield, the Architecture School, we have very close ties. Several teachers have been here for exchange, and also students have been on Erasmus exchange. So it's possible to take a term at Sheffield, and maybe some of you will be inspired. So give Tatjana a very warm welcome.
So this is working, yeah? You can all hear me? Yeah, you could probably hear me without this thing, but yeah, anyway. Thank you very much for having me also. Thank you for the very kind invitation to come. Meike already said that I will talk about this research project, which was called Alternative Architecture Praxis, or Spatial Agency later, which I started back in 2006 with Jeremy Till, so it's 10 years old. It's a bit frightening how quickly time passes, really. But I decided, it's not that I'm getting bored of it or anything, but I talk about it a lot, and I thought, because there's a lot of students here as well, I'll talk a little bit about why we did this project, why we initially started the project, and then I'll talk a little bit about the project itself, but also I want to talk about some of the limitations, you could say, or maybe, maybe critique a little bit of my own project as well. So 2006, quite a while ago, and a lot has happened since then, and of course, there were already very strong neoliberal tendencies back in 2006, but I guess, since then we have seen an even stronger, more severe dismantling of welfare states, selling off of housing, social housing, demolition of social housing, and so on and so forth. So all of this needs to be seen a little bit in this context. No? So the project was started before the financial crisis also, 2008, 2009. And I'll talk a little bit about my personal route into this project. So, okay. This is, of course, a selection of recent magazines, newspapers, public press on architecture, about architecture. And they show, of course, what we do, or what we tend to learn in architecture. We tend to learn about the design of buildings, about how to make space, and this is what we learn to do over 5 or more years. And all of this, and of course it's much more complex than this, but architecture is usually conflated with building. No? So when you talk to your friends, when you talk to other people who don't study architecture, and they ask you what you do, and they have a certain assumption about what it is that you might do. And so it's conflated with building. It's about form, aesthetics, tectonics. It's very much about the object. No? And I found this, and I still find this quite worrying, quite troublesome. And I find it troublesome because these photos, besides, you know, having the building very prominently, they're incredibly empty. There's undisturbed by people, they're undisturbed by stuff. It's there's never really that much context other than yeah, you have a little bit of greenery which hides the not so nice stuff behind, so that the nice object even shines out more strongly. Or you have, it's the same in this picture, you have a composition of shapes, the late afternoon sun, which is nicely reflected in the top windows. It's clean, it's beautiful, but we don't get any idea of where it is, context, the surrounding landscape. It's very, it's about this masterpiece. It's about the composition of buildings, and this goes on and on. And I don't think in this example the SketchUp model or whatever program you might use would look massively different from the actual building. It's neat lines. It's you can see people, you can see some action, but it's not really much more than that. And yet another one that shows architecture, how we, and forgive my generalizations as well, how we like to see it. There are no people. We see so that we actually can see the building properly. It's like a stage set. It's very choreographed. It's frozen in time and absolutely perfect in this moment of photography. And it's pure form, obviously, that is celebrated. So in a way, Manfredo Tafuri wrote about this in the 1970s. It's about architecture having achieved this. It's become sublimely useless. It's pure form, but nothing really else. And it is this cover which bothers me actually most, in its combination of, you see it in the right-hand corner, social space and this building. That's a little bit absurd. Quite poignant as well, that this is what we also consider when we say social space. And of course, this is not all there is to architecture, and I'll also come back to that in a moment, but there's a strong sense that this is what architects have to learn. In schools of architecture, it's I'm at a school in Great Britain, so it permeates our education and the curriculum. We learn buildings, how to do buildings from small scale to big scale. And architecture is form, and architects become these form givers. Or you could also say it in a different way. Buildings become very much like other products. They become brands. They become products like Apple or Nike or Prada. They're global. They have a certain exchange value. So we're not really talking about use value any longer, but it's about exchange value. And this notion of use value is somewhat disappearing. And as products, buildings become, and Reinier de Graaf, partner in OMA, wrote this, as products, buildings become tools of capital. And in becoming so, they have exchange value. I said that already. But and this is, as he says, antithetical to architecture's social mission. And obviously, this is it's not a new finding. It's writers in sociology and geography and in other fields, they have been writing about architecture's complicity with capital for a very long time. And of course, architectural theory has worked in this field as well. We've been critical about architecture's limitations and the limited role also in this beautifying mission, rather than talking about use. So now this goes a little bit into my own background, and this is when I started studying architecture, which was in the early 1990s. It was this book with these kind of illustrations that was one of the first books I bought, and you might recognize it, you might not. Does anyone recognize it? Yeah, Neufert, no, of course, you might still use it. I have no idea, does anyone still use it? Yes? Yeah? Okay, good. Okay. So for me, it was compulsory, and we couldn't do anything without it. And it's a book that, of course, you know that it educates you on how to design buildings in a way. It measures up meticulously every aspect of life. It's 80 years old, no? 1936. It was published for the first time. I bought edition 33, so I don't know what it is now. 50, maybe. So it tells you how much space a woman needs in the kitchen, how much space there should be between perfect table dinner arrangements and whatnot. No? Perfect arrangement for the height of lockers, everything you need to know. Everything is measured, from the very smallest item to the largest, and yeah, how much space you need in order to open a drawer, how much space you need when you open a window, how much space you even need when you have carry one or two suitcases. And what this book did, still does, I think, is that it somehow separates us as designers from the actual world. By writing all these dimensions down, we don't really measure ourselves any longer. We don't really look at how we might design space or how people use space. You could simply open the book on the appropriate page and you look at the dimensions and you sort of put them into your plan. And for me, this is, we also took his recommendations and simply added things together. So this is an illustration I found on Arkitektur, Neustadt City, which I found really telling because this is exactly what we did. No? We added measurements together, and this is what, in a sense, comes out. Form is about adding stuff additively. So you add the kitchen, the bathroom, the living room, bedroom, and it ends up as a building. And of course, there's multiple examples of these kind of measurements that became the starting point for ordering and standardizing people's lives. And this example is from the British context. I don't know why it disappears, but maybe it's a good thing. Okay, but what you saw before it disappeared, no? People sitting around a fireplace and watching TV, no? Neatly measured up. And what happens in these kinds of illustrations is that rooms become very, very specific because they're designed according to certain furniture dimensions and certain movements. And living room can only be living rooms, bedrooms can only be bedrooms, kitchens can only be used as kitchens. Every single part of the dwelling is designed in a way that first reflects and then determines the activity within. And there's absolutely no slack space. Everything is super efficient. And the architect in this kind of thing assumes control of his or her subjects or objects and their actions. And this, we argued, Jeremy and I, in flexible housing, leads to something that we called tight-fit functionalism, where spaces and rooms have very prescribed uses, prescriptive sizes, and also layouts. So the next part is a bit about my own rebellion in this process, you could say. When Neustadt was very much what determined my first part of my own education. This is now about me in this whole process, the dissatisfaction in a way of designing by numbers, this focus on form, maybe also this quite laissez-faire attitude about architecture's complicity with capital, with political or economic elites, or with power more generally. I was completely fed up with this, and the discussions in architecture seemed absolutely elitist also, absolutely unconnected to what really happened on the ground or outside my school's wall. And in 2000, this led to me, together with friends, founding a workers' cooperative in Glasgow. It was people who all shared the same kind of sense of discomfort. And what we did was we forgot about form, forgot about aesthetics, and looked at what was around us. And what happened around us was that swimming pools were closing down, plans were made to put motorways through very deprived neighborhoods. Housing was being privatized on a very big scale. And what we also found was that none of this was actually discussed by the architecture press, which is also why we made our own architecture press in a way and told our own stories. And like this one here. And I don't know, it's Glaswegian, so I can't, I'm not going to read it in Scottish, no, but what it says is, I used to stay in a tiny flat above the Surrey Height. A few years ago, the council moved us out, saying this that the building was unsafe or something. It was getting knocked down. Next thing, fucking no, they've been all done up, and all these other people moved in. New fucking windows, the lot. So it was about people being taken out of their council houses. They couldn't afford rents any longer. Things were being privatized, and we felt there was a real need to bring these stories also back into architectural education, into architectural discussions. So what we did, we had this little van, and we took these stories around Glasgow. We collected more stories and talked about space, architecture, planning, how decisions are and were made, how they affect people. We talked about economics and politics and the lot. So this is our own architecture press that then came out with this. We published 10 issues of this paper called Glaspaper over 6 years, and it was a format. It was free, and we distributed it for free across the city. So we we printed 5,000 copies every time, and it went into community centers and libraries and swimming pools, and we drove around and gave it to people, and so on and so forth. And it had lots of different formats as well, so it wasn't just academic, it wasn't just professional, it was, it had lots of funny stories, it had stuff that was written by people we had met. It was about drawings. The drawing I showed before was done by a local artist, and so it was a real combination of stuff that could engage people also in different ways about the things that were going on around them. So what we did with G.L.A.S was about this understanding that it was about understanding the consequences of intervening in space. What it meant to draw things by numbers, and what it meant if you translated it into the real world. It was about understanding that what we do was never really neutral, and realizing that firsthand, that lives also cannot be made efficient in the way that architects tend to do this very often, and that a lot of what was happening was not an architectural decision. Maybe that's also important to say. It wasn't just architects, of course, but it was embedded in wider political, economic, social discussions. So we worked locally with local campaign groups and reported on struggles, but also participated. We developed counter proposals. We worked on a more strategic level with groups internationally, and it sounds a bit banal, but what we realized was that the field and practice of architecture, of course, is much more complex, much more varied than what we had been taught about. And that there were also, in a way, lots of alternatives, so contrary to these stories that we heard in the schools of architecture, and we had come from quite varied backgrounds with but shared very similar stories, contrary to the relatively standard histories that we had all received as teaching. There were also lots of alternatives around that were partially overlooked by this normative architectural discourse on form, tectonics, and product. So all of this became a starting point for doing the project that became Spatial Agency. So my own personal trajectory, Jeremy's is very different, and Nishat, again, they would probably tell you a very, very different story. to mine. But for me, this was my starting point into a project that also was about conceptualizing a little bit the practice that I did with G.L.A.S. And it was about finding other alternatives, despite recognizing that there were lots of other practices around us. We still felt relatively isolated in the early 2000s. There wasn't much published. It's very different now, of course, but Spatial Agency became for me also a way of finding other practices that had and were operating like us, like G.L.A.S. It was about linking them up, making them visible, also giving them space. And I do a little bit of the technical stuff now. So we had two main research questions when we started this. And we wanted to find these practices and wanted to know what defined them. And the second one was about being interested in how they contributed to the development of contemporary and future architectural practice. So on the one hand, a little bit of historic stuff, what is there and how do they define themselves, but also how do they contribute to a different understanding of practice. And we collected data, and obviously this was absolutely not linear. It was iterative. It happened in big loops. We went back and forth between examples that we found. We clustered some which didn't work, then we clustered others. And this is a long list of the things that we did. We visited people, we interviewed others, we looked at books, we went into archives, we had lots of conversations, we spoke to lots of former students who were living or friends and colleagues and in other parts of the world who gave us their impressions. So it was, spreading yourself as widely as possible, but then always coming back again, looking at the material that we had and trying to make sense of it. So we had a hypothesis, obviously, to begin with, which we tested in these very loopy, very loose processes. And of course, we produced along the way a number of more polished outputs. So to broadly introduce the scope of this work, I'll just quote a few passages from the book, which unpick the term agency and also spatial before I move on to the other stuff. So I quote from the book. "We live, as Zygmunt Bauman argues, so compellingly in liquid times, which means that all the producers of space are enmeshed in the intertwining and restless arms of social networks, global networks, ecological networks, and virtual networks. Such engagement with wider spatial forces is both frightening and necessary. Frightening because they present a challenge to the safety blanket of the self-reflexive language that architecture has wrapped itself in since the Renaissance. Exposed to the multiple and often conflicting forces of these networks, architecture's pretense to any autonomy is shattered. Necessary because unless one at least recognizes these networks and architecture's place within them, then the likely fate that awaits architects is to be shunted into a cul-de-sac away from those networks, there to be reduced to polishers of static form and technical manipulators of stuff in the name of efficiency and progress. These are activities that consolidate and pander to the demands of the capitalist production of space, with shining form just another bauble in the endless production of commodities, and efficiency part of a wider program of spatial control in which lives are measured, ruled by the dictates of the market, zoned cities, smaller dwellings, the privatization of the public realm, and contractor-led provision of public buildings are just a few of the consequences. So if the introduction of the term spatial challenges the protective nature of the term architectural, and in so doing dissolves the protection of the title that the profession has so clearly clung to since Victorian times, then we do not see this as a negative consequence. Protection of a small patch of territory that of designing buildings has allowed others to claim the larger networks. Then a little bit about agency and what spatial agents are. Spatial agents are neither impotent nor all-powerful. They are negotiators of existing conditions in order to partially reform them. Spatial agency implies that action to engage transformatively with structure is possible, but will only be effective if one is alert to the constraints and opportunities that structure presents. Action depends on the capability of the individual to make a difference to a pre-existing state of affairs or course of events, writes Anthony Giddens. Agency means being able to intervene in the world or to refrain from such intervention with the effect of influencing a specific state of affair. The idea that withdrawing from a situation might be as appropriate an action as intervening is an interesting one in an architectural context. The normal modus operandi for an architect is to add something physical to the world. This alternative suggests that, in the spirit of Sedgwick Price, the addition of a building is not necessarily the best solution to a spatial problem, and that there are other ways of making a spatial difference. Agents act not alone, but as part of a mutual enterprise, hence Giddens' term mutual knowledge as a defining feature of the agent's makeup. Mutual knowledge is not determined by professional norms and expectations, but rather is founded in exchange, in negotiation, out of hunch, out of intuition. Mutual knowledge means abandoning the hierarchies embedded in most professional relationships, the I know more than you do. So what we do in the book is we go on to describe these groups' motivations. There are about 130 different groups in the book, a few more on the website, about 180 or so. So we talk about why people and practices did things in ways other than they might have had experience of before. We look at a group's site of action, so their main field of operation, whether that is about knowledge, dissemination of knowledge, something that is much more concerned with slightly more physical stuff, or social relations. And then we talk about the operations, the means through which this action or product is achieved. So the main tool, in a sense, the main method of these practices. So I'm not going to say much more about it, but the website complements the book, and those of you who might know the website might have used it also in this way, but it has on each side these dynamic whatever diagrams, and you can make your own connections, I guess, if you're interested in specific terms or specific practices. It shows you the networks that we think or we thought these practices are intellectually, but also actually embedded in. So this was our interpretation of the field that we found around us. So so we started this 10 years ago, of course, and as I said, the book is already 5 years old also, but it was, for us, it was a means to break up this very monolithic discourse on architecture, the discussion on form, on pragmatism, on discourse, and many things that happened around us. And for me, it showed different ways, critical ways of engaging with the production of space, and added also stuff to the normal histories of architecture. So it was also a bit of a propaganda tool, you could say. It became also a way to say, look, you know, there's much more to architecture than we're typically being told, and there's so much more to the production of space. If we only focus on objects, we are forgetting also about the subjects. We're forgetting about the people that actually use buildings, that live in buildings. We're forgetting about our position within these networks. It adds another history, of course, to the one that we normally learn, and it shows also how architecture and architects have operated beyond the building. And this is Nabil Hamdi, example from the 1970s, participatory housing project. But also, of course, we have Lacaton Vassal on the website. This is a very well-known project, no? The housing project in Mulhouse. So people that think their buildings through use and not just exchange. So in the beginning I talked about this exchange value and use value. This is clearly an example of thinking about how you use things and how use comes back as an important consideration in the making of space. It's about producing architecture that is not perfect in a way. This is a favorite example of mine by Krishna Doshi, Vatsushilpa in Ahmedabad in India. You see the housing as it looked like when it was built and as it is now. And it was something that was intentionally built to change. So the practice understood really well the latent self-building skills of the future inhabitants, and the building was planned to allow for changes and alterations in the outside, but also inside figuration to happen. Then obviously spatial agency also expands what maybe we normally consider to be architecture. It doesn't accept that buildings are all there is to architecture, and in a sense, you know, architecture's building is maybe only the tip of an iceberg. It's what is made when decisions have been made. Buildings tend to express these decisions. They are signifiers in a way of these expressions. So to make different spaces that care about users, care about the environment, care about the planet, we need to understand also much more how decisions are made, how cities work. And this example is the Center for Alternative Pedagogy in New York, who make publications about seemingly simple issues like where does our waste go, or where does our water come from. You know, we tend to take things for granted, but without really understanding how certain processes work, processes that relate to the making of space, we can't really engage in them properly. Spatial agency is also about engaging differently with people, and in ways that are fun and joyful and out of the box, that are messy and rough and don't seem to be super neat and fixed. And in this case, Raumlabor, it's not just about a critique of form, of the typical forms of maybe consultation or so, but it's also projective. The submarine was made out of waste materials, and the thing is used to challenge also existing planning processes and make proposals on how to change them. So, so what spatial agency has contributed massively, I think, to this field that is quite expansive now. It wasn't really 10 years ago or even 5 years ago. It's become quite substantial in recent years. I also find it really important to talk about the limitations of these kind of approaches. So certainly all of these books, all of these journals, all of the things that we find in the press as well about co-production, about self-management, about self-organization, about housing cooperatives, about building groups. It's all absolutely impressive, but I believe that this culture that has been developing, maybe especially since the financial crisis, is also not without its problems. So we have pop-up spaces here and there. We have participatory food workshops everywhere. We have urban agriculture in every city. And you really can't escape it any longer. And of course, Prinzessinnengarten, you might know this in Berlin, sort of urban learning space is what they call it. And the problem is, for all the good things that they do, I think it's really important to also talk about the problem, which is not just Prinzessinnengarten, but a whole range, a whole bunch of these projects, is that they have come to be regarded in a way as sort of solutions by decision makers, by politicians, also for all sorts of social issues. So I say solve, but of course that's not what it is. It's more of a camouflaging, it's a bit of a sugar coating of the fact that cities generally are strapped for cash, and these initiatives are also often a way to get things going again. So putting small amounts of money into such projects get cities a lot of attention, but also they get a lot out of it. So not surprisingly, there are then also more and more critical voices about what you could call also a kind of project culture. And in a sense, I refer here to a type of practice that thinks from project to project, from where funding also dictates what is being done, where chasing after the next pot of money leads to lack of critique or critical reflection about these spaces. And this is obviously also very much true in practical terms, but also for academic environments. So I recognize this also as the parameter for my own academic environment, where I, as a researcher and teacher, I think from project to project, but there's very little possibility of developing things with a longer perspective. So for short, you could say that there's too much project and too little system in many of these projects that now seem to be the emblems of this socially engaged architecture. And I'm saying this because the problem with many of the most progressive projects that were set up with the best of intentions often do the complete opposite. And what happens, and Neil Brenner writes about this extensively, there's a danger that projects, like Prinzessinnengarten, like Park Fiction, but many of the projects around produce short-term stuff for festivals and biennales and other events. They're effectively softening this very top-down governance. And they might be very nice and they might provide islands of otherness, but in the best-case scenario, they leave the status quo of the surrounding fabric and the city structures untouched. Or in the worst-case scenario, they are appropriated by the political and also economic elites and actively contribute to processes of gentrification, of which the Highline Park in New York is obviously a point in case. So whilst this island character of these projects, islands within otherwise unreconstructed fabric might be misleading, as the true embeddedness of these projects might be unclear, so they might be very well connected to nationally, globally, to other projects and so on and so forth, so the island might not be an actual island. There is still this issue that the actual space and the consequences of its implementation are very often not properly investigated. And I quote Neil Brenner on the dangers of this form of urbanism. And he writes, a design intervention that is putatively oriented towards expanding and activating the urban public sphere accelerates processes of gentrification, displacement, and exclusion at the neighborhood and urban scales. The construction of a supposedly open urban space thereby creates new barriers to a genuinely public, democratic, and egalitarian urbanism, not only within the site of intervention, but across the surrounding fabric of buildings, blocks, and neighborhoods. With all respect to the specificities of national and local context, some version of this narrative could, alas, be elaborated with reference to a long list of prominent project-based design interventions in major cities around the world, including many of those in which quite imaginative, skillful, and ostensibly progressive design schemes have been implemented. And it seems that often the seemingly alternative spaces are not too different any longer from the other architects or architectures they are implicitly or also explicitly critiquing. So, so I wonder whether the Bilbao effect that was in everyone's attention a few years ago is really that different from what you could call the Highline effect. Are they not producing the same kind of thing, attracting tourism and at the same time generating income, but not necessarily for people in the city, but for the developers who are wealthy enough to build alongside. So the problem might be that this kind of architecture of the other, so the alternative developments, are often entrenched in the same systems, in the same structures and mechanisms of production and finance also as all other normative production. So Highline Park might be a very extreme example, but it might also serve as a very good example to to make visible very clearly the operations of the property market. And the park is owned by the City of New York. It's a public park that nevertheless has a long list of park rules. You're not allowed to sit on railings. No, you're not picking flowers and plants. Okay, I get that. Bicycles are not allowed. Use of skateboards, skates, and recreational scooters. Solicitation, commercial activity. Drinking alcohol is forbidden. Gatherings greater than 20 people is forbidden, and it's also a non-smoking place. And all of this reminds also of other privatized, in inverted commas, urban spaces. And this is the list of restrictions of the of an inner urban development in Zurich, the Europaallee, seemingly urban space, which creates a passage between the train station and another road, and it says the same things basically. No? You're not allowed to put posters up. You're not allowed to film. You're not allowed to beg. You're not allowed to feed pigeons, smoke, or leave your cigarettes somewhere. So it's private ground, but the rules for this example of co-produced bottom-up city regeneration is the same effectively as in privatized urban developments. So coming back to New York, of course the initiators of the Highlight Park and the architects involved in it and all the other people cannot necessarily be accused of being the initiators also of the gentrification that comes up along with it. But in hindsight, it's also clear that even the City of New York's initial investment in the park, so the City of New York also gave $115 million to support the project, was also very lucrative for the city. The park, which is, I talked about this, celebrated as an example of democratic and collective urban planning, is also a very calculated piece of investment and development, which attracted numerous investors who are now selling apartments with a view onto the park as a premium. And of course, none of this money is going back into the park. So what I'm trying to say is that there are certain questions that seem important and remain untouched broadly. We circle around them, but we never really get to the core of them. All of these spaces that are made by Raumlabor, by other activists, by Lacaton Vassal, they might provide different kinds of architectures. They might counter the hard spaces of modernity, and they might be more fun and much more flexible. But they don't really help us to fundamentally rethink how architecture and how space is produced. They don't really tackle issues of affordability on a bigger scale, on inequality on a bigger scale. They don't really tackle injustice on a larger scale, or the dissolution of the welfare states. And I just wonder whether we can really pretend much longer that these spaces are only good, that it's enough for them to be fun, that they're neutral in terms of their consequences. Is it really okay for the alternatives to become means of making property, other property, even more valuable? And the key question in this might be the following, and it's about whom you want to be of service to as an architect, planner, spatial designer, or simply human being. And just consider this quote here by Claude Schneider, and he writes about Meike. He says, which way will you go, architect? Will you succumb to the bourgeoisie, which shall earn you wealth, fame, and perhaps success in a world of the scantily housed and homeless? Or will you march into battle to fight for a different society? Progress, what is it to you? Beautification through decoration, perfection of details, cutting of cost, to whose benefit? You have to decide on which side will you be. Now, of course, this all sounds a little bit black and white, and we can talk about this. Is there lots of gray in the middle? I don't know. But spatial agency, I think, opens up some of the more fundamental questions. It's not just about different aesthetics, which in a sense have been co-opted already and appropriated by neoliberal policies anyway, or even the language is appropriated of localism and the local. So it's not just about making spaces that engage differently, but about how architecture as a discipline, as a field, as a profession operates, what its concerns are, and how these concerns are framed. And Claude Schneid for me describes this, I don't know, ideal position maybe of architecture, away from architecture as a tool of capital towards an architecture of the social. And there are lots of issues today that need attention, no doubt about this. And all issues and problems can become objects of design processes. So it's our choice which ones to pick. So following Schneid, our field of operation is here in understanding the conditions of scarcity and migration. It's about challenging planning apparatuses. It's about in the production and reproduction of inequalities. It's in the continuation of award ceremonies that give prizes to architects for their uncompromising approach to form. And also in the production of teaching methodologies that lead to the reiteration of a form of architecture that continues the status quo. And of course, there are many, many other issues. And yes, all issues and problems can become objects of design processes, but all of these have got to be considered in their structural contracts. So in the teaching environment, in our universities, this for me is a key starting point to shift attention to these other issues, to these other things that need urgent attention. So from something that looks like this, which is gray and black and like this, crossed arms, leaning back, disengaged and bored, we need to move to something like this as a way of working. And this is not so much about the notion of being outside our schools of architecture. It's not just that that one should constantly move out of the buildings that do live projects or whatever you want to call them, but about an attitude to learning which is about investigating issues first before solutions, or before non-solutions follow. So it's about being open to whatever you encounter. And that counts for all sides. And it is in this spirit of also radical pedagogy about the notion of working with others rather than for others. And of course, if taken seriously, this has quite fundamental consequences for our traditional classrooms. It has consequences also for the tools of architecture, and poses questions about how to work with and mobilize the real. And for me, the real also includes theory. I don't think we nearly enough look at this context of theory in relation to the actions that we do. There's a lot of critique, but there's very, very little proper theory, proper reflection on the kind of products that come out of education. So it's about how to work with the information that we find, which information we deem as important or relevant. But setting these into a much broader structural context. This is Larissa Fassler. She's an artist, but produces these amazing detailed surveys of urban spaces that overlap the spaces with her own experience, the things that she finds in newspapers, and she overlaps and gives a much richer depiction, I think, of the kind of systems of order, the systems of operation in these spaces than many, many other depictions. So Spatial Agency, and this is my last slide, argues that these issues and their transformation through reflection in and with theory, that we need to make our attention as architects, as planners, as spatial designers, but very broadly as citizens. It's about architecture as a social discipline that considers its structural context and works transformatively from within. And this here is an illustration of work done by the Cross-Border Initiative led by Fonna Forman. She's a political scientist, and Teddy Cruz, architect, who I would say engage precisely in these questions of education, structure, and transformation, and at the same time avoid the co-option of their work through political and economic elites. So what they do is not just about the projecting of alternative futures in praxis, but also in theory, which is crucial, but they add another element of this to this duality. So I talked about praxis and theory, but for them it's a third element, which is about building strategic alliances with politics, with economic elites, with community leaders, with policy frameworks, and who then enable the actual implementation of these projected alternative futures, not just on a small scale, but on a much more strategic level. And this work here is no longer just about a project that finishes and you start a new one, a project that works within its own logic, but is largely disconnected from its context, but an approach that addresses space in its systemic complexities in order to mobilize different visions that are based on this very elusive concept of a just society, but on a very, very large scale. And this is, I think, where spatial agency sort of contributes to as well, or can contribute to. It's not just about addressing the symptoms of inequality, injustice, and all these kind of issues, environmental degradation or so, but provides a very integrated approach to understanding complexity. That's not just about the island scale. You see the island here, but there are these networks into the bigger urban context, but has the power to make new systems and new institutions. And despite the obvious limitations and its danger of co-option, this is also, and I did say that, where I still see the true potential of spatial agency still. And that's me. Thank you. Okay.